Welcome to all our great panelists today, and welcome to our even greater audience out there in the real world. I'd like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded. For those of you in the audience, the chat has been disabled. You can ask questions anytime you want, but go down to where it says Q&A. Para esta sesión hay interpretación al español, and there's interpretation to English. So you can just choose the language that you like to listen to it in. Down at the bottom where it says, there's a little globe and it says interpretation. Now I would like to introduce you to the brains behind this wonderful gathering, this launch of the transportation issue of ReVista, and to Diane Davis, who is going to be our moderator. Diane Davis is the Charles Dyer Norton Professor of Regional Planning and Urbanism at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and she's the co-author, among many other books, of Transporting Urban Transport. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, June. It's really great to be here. I want to make a slight correction. The title of that book is Transforming Urban Transport, but that's just a minor point, because I'm so happy to be moderating this event with this embarrassment of riches of scholars and practitioners from all over the Americas who've been working on issues related to transit equity, transit and transport mobility, as well as infrastructure. When June contacted me, I guess it was a little over a year ago, about wanting to do a special issue of ReVista focused on transportation, I jumped to the occasion because I've been thinking about this topic for decades. My first research, actually, my dissertation was about the decision to build the subway in Mexico City. I moved away to questions of governance and then came back to thinking a little more about politics and leadership in the implementation of sustainable transport projects that led to the book that June mentioned. But in the course of these many different angles into sustainability, urbanization, and transportation, I've had the opportunity to meet some amazing people who have informed my own ways of thinking, and I've learned so much from. And almost all of them are here today with us and have contributed to this special issue. So I do want to give a shout out to June for pulling together this great group of practitioners and scholars. And I highly recommend everybody take a look at the special issue, which looks at things ranging from gender questions in mobility to rural transit to sustainability as understood both from the lens of citizens as well as states. What we're going to do today is we have had a pre-meeting with all the members, all the different people who've signed on to present some of their work, and they have been asked to discuss among themselves some of the contemporary challenges that face scholars and practitioners who care about equity, mobility, and sustainability. And what we will do now is I'll turn it over to the leader of each of one of these four groups to introduce him or herself, introduce his group, and then share some of the thoughts that we've had or that they've shared among themselves about transit and mobility challenges, as well as equity and sustainability. Then in the meantime, I would like all of you in the audience who have questions to post them on the Q&A. After we hear from the four different groups, we will share some of the questions that come from you, and hopefully you'll be inspired by the presentation. So without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to the leader of group one, who is Julie Gamble. I will introduce you, Julie, first, Assistant Professor of Urban Studies at Trinity College here in Connecticut. Julie?
Hi, thank you so much, Diane, for the introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this special issue. June, thank you so much, as well as all of your colleagues who have worked so hard at putting this special issue together. So I am going to just briefly, I've already been introduced. So my name is Julie. I study issues related to mobility and immobility in Quito, Ecuador. But for the particular article that I wrote for this piece, I was looking at gendered cycling in Quito at a time when there were new bike lanes that were being constructed due to mobility restrictions around the pandemic. So I followed them digitally via WhatsApp and then followed up with GoPro ride-alongs to get senses of what they felt between ideas of security and insecurity. I'll pass it to my group members. CAROLYN.
Thanks, Julie. I'm CAROLYN. My article in this issue of ReVista is stems from my research in Mexico City around gender equity in transportation and current initiatives to make Mexico City's transportation system more gender equitable. And I will hand it off to another member of our group. I don't see everyone's face, but maybe Juan.
RAFAEL.
Okay, great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rafael. I am an urban designer practicing at Sasaki. I have a background in urban design with master's in urban design from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And in this issue, I contributed with part of my research in regional transportation in Sao Paulo, looking back into a chronology of how Sao Paulo transitioned away from river infrastructure to rail, further to roads, and how those affected both the region of Sao Paulo and the state, but also urban life. And I'm really happy to be here and passing it forward to another group member, Juan.
Juan unfortunately couldn't stay for the second session. I'll briefly just talk about his work, his article. He is doing a personal sort of reflection. He grew up between between Sao Paulo and Lima, and he spent time in the pandemic between Lima, Peru, and Madrid. And his article discusses sort of this idea of the temporal use of old infrastructures, thinking about the possibilities of what cycling can bring to the city. ARON, you are our final group member.
Okay, hello everyone, my name is ARON Lesser and I'm a graduate student in urban planning at Harvard. And for this issue, I wrote a piece about a group of residents in central Mexico City and how they protested a transportation project as a way to negotiate broader issues about public space, equity, etc. And so it's really about where participation fits into the city's new mobility climate. And we had a really great discussion. Thank you, Julie, for the introduction and everyone else.
Fantastic. Okay, so within our group, what we did was we discussed sort of this, question around, well, how do we think about within the constrictions of economic development and sustainability, what will transport and mobility look like for the next 5 years? And we talked about it along a lot of different, from a lot of different vantage points. So what I'll do is just try to summarize really quickly what I think were the major takeaways from our group. One is just beginning to think about the idea of the small scale. How are we really considering what small scale urban mobility solutions look like? A lot of our group members focus on cycling, so that was obviously thinking through an old technology, but also its sort of more permanent role in Latin American cities. But not just thinking about the actual physical infrastructure itself, but also thinking about it from a gendered lens, given that it is a prominent fact that lots of women use, or a majority of women use public transportation within cities. In that our trip chains are often more complicated due to care responsibilities. So thinking about how if we focus on a gendered lens at a small scale urban mobility approach, what that can offer for both more short-term solutions in terms of women's mobility around the neighborhood, but then also different solutions that are more long-term when considering other amenities that we might need within the neighborhoods. Then the next, and that using the idea of small scale mobility is also can possibly be a catalyst for thinking through economic development and also sustainability itself. That led us to questions about for whom are these new mobility and transport solutions going to be for? And what those processes look like, thinking about the restrictions of land use and how that continues to be a problematic for Latin American cities, and particularly as urban amenities continue to be invested within more high income areas. And then also thinking about outside of moments of citizen participation that are often part of formal planning processes, actually paying more attention to anywhere from protests to social movements and their broader political implications. And then finally, more just thinking through, we still do need large scale infrastructures, and that is an element of the city that's not going to be away in terms of how we move from different points that are not necessarily linear within the city, considering what old infrastructures provide for us and how we reuse them. But then also thinking in conjunction to, we can reuse these old infrastructures, but if we don't consider how they're being adapted for climate change, then we are not going to be necessarily successful in thinking through these old governance decisions that are sort of more permanent or imperial relics within our urban environments. Thank you.
Great. Oh my goodness, you guys kept right on time. I'm so impressed. I do want to say something for the larger audience, which I neglected to, so I apologize. One of the things we asked this group to, all four of the breakout groups to consider when they met among themselves to discuss, the latest ideas and challenges in sustainable transport, was to think a little bit more about the current moment, the fact that we've just finished COP26 a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lot of noise and conversation on the global governance agenda about the issue of dealing with the urgency of climate change, which many of the scholars who are going to be speaking here today and practitioners are framing their work on transport sustainability through climate change, as Julie just underscored, but thinking about the balance between advancing sustainability efforts in the context of kind of climate crisis and economic development. All of our authors are focused on countries across the global South, particularly obviously in this ReVista issue, Latin America, central from Mexico all the way down to Chile. We have papers on Brazil, on Peru, on Chile, and Colombia, and Mexico as well. And there was a large debate about the trade-offs between economic development in these countries and dealing with the problem of climate crisis, where much of the responsibility lies in the global North. And so we asked our groups to think a little bit about that. And thank you, Julie, for talking about the issue of adaptation and reuse and equity questions and how that needs to be inserted into any discussion about climate resilient futures through the lens of sustainability. So let's move to group two. The leader of group two is Ted McDonald, who's a lecturer here at Harvard in social studies. Ted, do you want to introduce yourself and your group and share a little of your thoughts?
Yes, but I have to apologize first. I've been in communication with my colleagues and indigenous people in Latin America yesterday, today, and I also had 2 medical appointments. One was an operation. So I've missed the opportunity to get the group together and do informally. So what I'd like to do is just very, very briefly introduce my general approach to this whole idea of transportation. And the name of the article we have is From Inroads to Transportation. I, like many other people, have worked in the upper Amazon and the Amazon region, into which roads are relatively new. And almost everybody regarded a road as an entrance, an inroad, coming in. Almost all the people who lived there questioned that. Why do we want those people coming in? They would initially not even colonists. They were initially those exploiting things from the area and taking it out. And I lived for years in areas where people just said, we don't want roads around here. We don't want them because they're going to come in. They're going to take our oil. Not our oil. They're going to destroy our trees while they're taking oil, doing a whole series of very, very economically successful for them, but not nearly in any way influential at the local level. So most of what we discussed was going all the way from the Inca Empire, which didn't make its way into the northern Ecuadorian Amazon, into the roads that came in from Brazil and the big roads that came in with the oil company. Almost all of them were opposed by indigenous people because they also brought with them colonists who took their land. And what I've had the good fortune of doing, and I hope that my student Megan Monteleone is here, she went back to the same village after the road had come in and found out that indeed there were inroads. Indeed, there were concerns about that, people coming in, taking the land, changing things. But the most important thing she noticed, and which we both were delighted by, is that for the first time ever, women left, particularly young women. And they went to school, which did not exist in the community before and did not exist in many of the isolated areas. They have gone on to do extraordinary things, breaking down the standard distinction between men and women in Amazonian villages, where the men do the hunting and the fishing and the women do the garden work and taking care of the children. It's a division of labor. It's not necessarily anything unsettled or anything like that, but it did become that way later. And what's happened now, we've noticed, is the roads have opened, and many of the young people have gone out, particularly some of the young women who have moved into jobs and positions which are extraordinary. They've moved into what they call tourist positions, which are actually environmental issues, and they've gone into the politics of the ethnic federations, which have emerged roughly since the 1960s and largely in the 1970s, to become leaders in them. So we shifted rather than be overly critical of what can happen in an inroad, which much has been done, and I hope other people can discuss it. We've looked at the other side. How have nice buses taking people out on a fairly regular manner improved some people's lives and livelihoods, particularly the women? Okay. And I'd love to hear others, but I haven't been able to communicate with the group in general, so I'm not sure what to do right now.
Well, I mean, you had a breakout room. I think I would ask whether Roberto or Raul or anybody who was in that room this morning has anything that they'd like to add before we move to the next group.
If anybody in the group would like to add something,
I'd like to also have them. Yes, and I'd also like to have them introduce themselves, please.
Yeah.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Diane. Voy a tomar.
Thank you very much, Diane. I'm going to take this opportunity that you gave me to be able to speak about what you are suggesting to us with this. In my origin, well, I was working in research about transportation issues that have been very diverse, logistical issues, technical and economic aspects, and I had first contact with rural transportation when it was pertaining to improving this inroads for indigenous people in Mexico. And of course, the experience was very enriching. We had to make a decision for the community to improve this road along with other funds, because it was in their interest as well to have a simpler form, because they didn't have a lot of these services in some of these towns, and they would have to go to the neighboring city. They would be able to have access to healthcare service, etc. agricultural products. And fortunately, building this road made this possible. It allowed many people to be able to have access, because along with this road, a regular service came about for transportation that allowed them to travel and to save time. But not everybody had money to be able to use this. And some people would have to get off in other parts of the road. They would have to take a donkey or a horse. Some people rode their bikes. And other people who had more purchasing power, they were able to buy a motorcycle. But while the problems with income in the social atmosphere, it continues to exist. So what risks were there in terms of environmental issues? Well, it's an area that's mountainous and has forest. And one of those risks was that the road was going to allow illegal foresting and the extraction of wood to happen, illegal extraction of wood to then be taken to the markets. Of course, this was not something that was desirable. And regardless of transportation, we had to do other things to prevent this. But however, what I wanted to share from my experience, and in the research study that we have done case studies about rural areas, is that there's this trend to have a large protection of the environment because of carbon, etc. And we have to structure mechanisms in certain regions to be able to capture resources that allow us to provide ecological resources. We have to allow some type of access so that the community can supply themselves with their basic needs as well. Thank you very much.
Danielle, if you could say a few more things from your group, and then we'll move it on to the next group. Let me just also underscore that what I think is so special about this issue is that when we're thinking about mobility and transportation, that we're also looking at rural transit, as we just heard from both Ted and Roberto. Sometimes we tend to think of it as a problem only, in the cities and big cities, but the needs of connectivity between rural and urban areas are important for both access, social equity, but also for economic development. And that may be one issue that we can come back to in some of the other groups when they talk about the trade-offs between climate change, sustainability, and economic development. But Danielle, would you like to say a few things before we turn it over to the next group?
Yes, for sure. Yes. So one of the things that, so hi everyone, my name is Daniel. One of the things that came up in our group was this idea of the importance of tertiary roads, of caminos de herradura, that still have rural transportations. And one of the things that I touched on my essay, a photo essay that I created in collaboration with my cousin, Cristian Camilo Garcia, is a traditional method of transportation called chivas, which are basically modified buses that are very commonly used throughout Latin America, but in Colombia specifically, these are wooden buses, are very colorful, but they have been modified for the rough terrains. And these buses nowadays, you can see them in the cities, and they're used basically as party buses, also very folkloric sort of cultural emblems. But in rural areas such as my hometown, Monzón, these are quite crucial for daily transportation. So this is just one of the things of many methods of transportations, and that are still important for Latin America and rural Latin America. So Raúl, maybe you want to close with some of the examples. Thank you.
Yes. The main challenge for Latin American countries is to invest in a balanced way in a large infrastructure in large cities as well as in rural infrastructure. And the roads only make sense when they need a network nationwide, citywide. It has to be balanced, it has to be planned. And beyond connecting people with broader life, as Professor MacDonald said, it's important for development of local market, internal market, to extend approaches to production. It is fundamental for life of people in the rural area, and it is important for the country as such, and for people that live in the cities. Benefits are general, and examples in Peru are many. In the article that we wrote in the rural roads, what could be found in the article of the forest in Peru. And in case you need further information, you can write and contact me.
Number 3, that's headed by Julio Davila. Julio, you can introduce yourself and your group, please.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, June, for the opportunity of joining this wonderful group, and particularly publishing in ReVista, which is a wonderful magazine, now only online, sadly, but nonetheless much more accessible. We had a group of 4 people: José Ángel de León, Jorge Mujica, María Elena Cuña, Jorge and María Elena from Chile, José Ángel from the Canary Islands, but he's worked on Cuba. I don't know whether it's probably quicker, given that we're short of time, if I introduce you guys, if you don't mind. So Jose Angel is doing, I think, a PhD in Romance language and literature, looking at the cultural side of transport in Cuba. Jorge is he's a historian of science, and he's about to start a doctorate in geography at the Universidad Católica de Chile. And María Elena is a social anthropologist working on gender equity, and that's how she arrived at the issue of transport. I myself am Professor of Urban Policy and International Development at University College London. So hi everybody from a very chilly, very dark London, very stormy at the moment. And I've been working on the issue of transport, mainly from the angle of local governments. What can local governments do to sort of rebalance the tendencies of capitalism towards inequity and inequality, both spatial and social, but also economic. And I think the local governments have quite a lot of tools in their armory, if they're given them by central governments, by politics, to actually redress those imbalances. And I've been working on that for quite a while, initially on water and sanitation, more recently on transport. And the case that I've brought in my article was the case of the cable cars in Medellin, which was the mother, or probably grandmother, of all the cable car systems that are now present in several countries. I reckon about 7 countries in Latin America. Mexico City is just doing a very major project with several cable cars. La Paz, of course, has a complete system of cable cars with about 10 lines, which are the equivalent of a mass transit system. Medellin itself now is up to 6 lines. All of them, in the case of Medellin, except for one, linking high density, low income, very steep, hilly, formerly informal settlements, highly populated, very dense, and in the case of Medellin, in the initial ones, very problematic socially, in terms of violence, in terms of deprivation. And the argument, and this is what I reflect on after maybe 12, 14 years of working on thinking of them and looking at other cable cars, is how they've served to not only connect physically these neighborhoods, which were half abandoned, forgotten, neglected, with the rest of the city, so giving opportunities to people that didn't have them physically, but also what comes with them, and the investment that came with the cable cars, in particularly Línea K in Medellin, which is, as I said, the grandmother of all the cable cars, in that sense. The investments that came with that, which were major social infrastructure and upgrading, were probably as important, if not more important than the connectivity. So the discussion, just to be brief, and apologies to the group, and I'll give you a chance obviously to complement my views on this. What we discussed is that the mobility is central to the economic development of economic, social, and individual development of cities. We did focus specifically on cities in contradistinction to the previous group, which worked on the rural transport. We looked at urban transport of passengers, not other kinds of transport. And of course, mobility, because we're looking at the social dimensions of transport. Central to this, we said, is the notions of access, but also of connectivity. And connectivity increasingly, particularly after the pandemic, but more and more with technology, it can also be seen from a digital side. So the physical connectivity has to be seen hand in hand with digital connectivity. But of course, only a few workers and a few people in the city are able to access digital connectivity in the way that we are doing from different countries around the world. So it is still a limited issue. The other dimension that we looked at is in terms of transport. The issue was raised that transport cannot be seen, or mobility cannot be seen only from a point of view of productivity or material production, but it has to be seen from an angle of care and social interactions around health, around education. So there's a very strong social dimension on it, and it's something that some of us have been working on for a while. In response to Diane's question, or Diane and June's question about that Diane mentioned in terms of COP, crucial to the issue of transport and going forward in terms of cities in Latin America growing, more investment going into them, is the issue of carbon footprints of cities. And it is very clear from quite a lot of evidence, but it needs to be sort of nailed down, that the poor in cities in Latin America have a lower, often a much lower carbon footprint than the rich. The rich drive big cars, they travel by airplane, they have big houses that cost a lot of money and carbon units to build or destroy. And any new project in terms of transport, for example, has to take into account that carbon element of the investment or the construction process, but also the demolition of existing structures. So, you know, clearly a railway system or a road which knocks down houses and entire buildings will have enormous costs from a point of view of carbon footprints than compared to, for example, a cable car, which has a very minimal footprint, literal and from a carbon point of view, in the sense that very little is demolished. So that dimension of carbon footprint should be added to it. The issue of pilot projects was raised. We didn't quite get to that point. It was raised by Jose Angel. Perhaps he can sort of explain a little bit more in terms of the novelty that city spaces allow for exploration and innovation. I would say to that, yes, that the pilot projects are important, but the issue of scaling up is also crucial, because we can't just go on from pilot to pilot, but I want to open it to Jose Angel and maybe my colleagues. The final point I want to say before I open it to my colleagues is the issue of equity. The issue of equity was very central to the discussions we had, both internal to cities, and Jorge raised the issue of Transantiago and promesas incumplidas that Transantiago represented in terms of modernizing the transport. So clearly, and he mentioned that the newer buses, the less polluting electric or hybrid buses that have been introduced, have appeared in the richer neighborhoods, not in the poorer neighborhoods. So there's an internal issue of inequity within cities, but there's also an issue of inequity between cities, you know, in the sense that Chile probably is the most extreme case of this in Latin America, in the sense that a lot of the investments in infrastructure go into Santiago, not into the provincial capitals. So that inequity is also territorial. And I think that is pretty much it. If anybody else wants to complement, please do. I must have left, and apologies, I must have let quite a lot out. So to my colleagues, please.
if there are any quick comments, we'll take them. Otherwise, maybe we'll move to the next group and you can have
Okay, fine.
thing. So I don't know. I do want to allow your group. Does anybody else want to add? You did an excellent job, Julio, of summarizing
Thank you, Dan.
some of the key challenges. Anybody? No, well, let me turn it over to Ignacio Cardona, who is the head of the fourth group. I have a feeling that maybe the question of equity will kind of come up again. I do want to, just before I turn it over to group 4, underscore the comments that Julio made about the fact that low-income populations in all over the world, but in particularly in Latin American cities, do not contribute the same amount to carbon footprint per capita because of poverty and conditions in which they live. And so it does raise the larger question about how does one think about equity at multiple scales, global, should global North and global South countries be following the same agenda? And also Julio brought up the difference even between big cities in Latin America and smaller towns. Where's the equity about who is producing the problems of climate change and who is basically should be responsible for addressing them through mobility changes? So Ignacio, let's turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to follow up that comment, Diane, because that was exactly the beginning of our discussion. We were basically trying to relocate the questions, because commonly when we talk about these trade-off between economic development and sustainability, commonly there are some topics like greenhouse gases emissions and new technologies, and we were saying that the contribution of Latin American countries to the greenhouse gases emissions is not that big, not because we chose to produce less, but because economic imbalance. Most of the people move with other means of transportation rather than with car mobility or the mobility that produces greenhouse gases emissions. So we wanted to relocate the discussion to the issue of equity and to the issue of connecting sustainability with equity and spatial justice. But let me present first the first person that we're in our group. Luis, are you around, please? Luis Guzman.
Yes, hello. I'm going to talk in Spanish for our Latin America audience, okay? Gracias, Ignacio.
Thank you, Ignacio. Yes, we were talking in our previous panel, and as Diane was saying, we have a very severe problem, and that is climate change, because we suffer a lot and we suffer from climate change. However, we are not the main causes of climate change. Colombia doesn't even contribute in a 1% to the greenhouse gases in the world. In the short term, in the next 5 years, we will be renewing our vehicle fleet, and we will be improving our public transportation systems and active mobility, roads, and infrastructure in general. We need to solve something that is more urgent, and this is what our article is about, and that is the great difference and the great segregation, spatial segregation, deal with informal work, informal housing, and that these individuals that have informal work, informal housing are the ones that suffer the most through these inefficient mobility systems, and they spend too much time in traffic, and they suffer compared to others. With these brief words, I would like to offer the floor to Daniel so he can tell us about informality and how our mobility system in Bogota has reinforced these issues that exclude the population that is working in an informal way.
Thank you very much, Luis, for handing me over the floor. My name is Luis Daniel. A little bit continuing with the explanation, the discussion from our group, and also based on our article as well, something that we were talking about is that you have to rethink mobility in terms of justice. Justice should be that main objective in the short and long term. We spoke a little bit about the neighborhoods that have the largest amount of informality in terms of jobs and housing and transportation, and that you can walk through these neighborhoods, but you're not able to ride bikes there, for example. And so they can't move about in sustainable ways. And the people who have more access and have more opportunities and have more access to jobs, they have private cars that pollutes more. And Uber, they can also have access to Uber, which is also a way to decentralize the private cars. And that's what we were thinking about in our discussion. First, to think about equity as a driving force for environmental justice. And those who are generating the largest amount and the largest weight and social cost of socio-environmental costs are also the ones who are able to finance this redistribution of public expenses and of infrastructure, obviously also recognizing informality as an essential part of our urban structure and recognize its positive innovations as well as possible ways to maximize this effect and this positive effect. And I would also like to have go on to the next person who has a positive reflection on this as well. Cheo, I don't know if you're here. Yes, sorry. I lost my service for a moment. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm a journalist of pedestrian mobility here in Caracas in Venezuela, but I'm also connected in the Latin American sentiments for walkable cities and in this laboratory, in this research laboratory. For the journal, I was able to see data about study from 2018, and I was able to look at the text from a very personal aspect. Somebody who was about to turn 60 and had problems with their knee. And because of that infrastructure, they really weren't able to walk well through the city. And people would always use cars more. In our group, in our conversation, I would like to point out that there isn't really sustainability or economic development without having inclusion. I think that's an important point. And in real power, continue to have an exclusive model that somehow this governs our cities. And I would like to take advantage of this. And it seems to be a discomfort, but maybe there are other people who walk about, but in very poor conditions. And I wanted to share this discomfort to be able to show this image of the pyramid of investment of mobility, that a lot of things are down on the bottom, but we know that this is actually inverted. So we wanted to think about a scale with public investment and business opportunities that are focused on changing this scale and have more mixed uses and not having residential areas distributed around the city, but looking at it with mobility in a different way. Now I'm going to hand over the floor to Ignacio so he can supplement what I was saying. Juan Pablo. Thank you. Yes, very quickly, I'm Juan Pablo CAICEDO. I've graduated from the urban design program at Harvard. I am the leader of the project in Bogota. And we wrote an article about how this project aims to be an opportunity to fulfill what we've been speaking about with clean transportation and social justice. That's also seeking to facilitate being able to move around better in these cities. And I know we don't have very much time, so I'm going to hand over the floor to Arturo so that he can speak about his work as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. In the World Bank, there was a number of documents. It's called Transport, Decarbonization, and Investment. That's a series. Mine was the foundation for the document that I published in the journal that has to do with how to resolve this paradox that we're hearing. People in developing cities, specifically in Latin America, largely use public transportation. They walk and they ride bikes, but the conditions are not there unless income goes up. And we also have to improve the conditions of public transportation, of sidewalks, of the bike lanes. They have the advantage that it will allow people to be able to gain access to better employment opportunities, to connect better with these opportunities. So we want to look at this virtuous cycle, especially in Latin America, and the Global World Bank is a point of reference because there's about an 80% that we can reach. Africa is about 50. So Latin America will always be a point of reference in this sense. But the issue of social justice and decarbonization of public transportation go hand in hand, and they are compatible. So I'm going to hand over the floor now.
I'm trying to wrapping up everything that we discussed in less than 3-4 minutes. So yeah, I'm Ignacio Cardona. I'm both architect and urban designer. And Diane was one of my advisors in my Doctor of Design degree at Harvard Grad School of Design. I was really happy to work with her, working about the spatial opportunities for underprivileged communities in Latin America. So, and my article is basically, I'm comparing the case of Santo Domingo in Medellin, the same case that Julio Davila was talking about, and the case of San Agustin in Caracas, to demonstrate that infrastructure itself doesn't build urban structure. We need to overlap them with other layers of design, project, and governance in order to produce social equity. And so we were discussing a lot about the importance of reframe sustainability within the idea of the right to the city and access to the resources that the city has as a whole. And I was really lucky to work with these 5 amazing scholars. I strongly invite you to read their articles, basically because they were combining some ideas from the theory with some practice, because they are all policymakers and practitioners in different realms. So for that reason, we were really trying to strategize some possible interventions, trying to respond to this idea of the response in less than 5 years. So we were dividing our proposal in 2 categories: first, design, and second, governance. In terms of design, we proposed 3 ideas. First is trying to narrow down the scales of transportation and mobility. Try to understand that, yes, we have global problem and regional problems, but trying to understand that the people who live in an underprivileged settlements, neighborhood far from the city, needs to be connected to the resources that the city has in order to produce more social equity. Second is, rather than understanding transportation in terms of the maximization of journeys, trying to understand the overlap of these infrastructure with other systems and to produce or maximize clean travels. So sometimes it's better to do more travel that is cleaner than to have the faster travel. And third is because both first one were related to the space, how you manage the spatial urban relations. The third one is more how you manage the time, the time process of any project. Is basically how we can connect short-term project that we can develop in only 5 years. Remember that some of them are working daily with troubles, and they need to create responses to particular issues in their cities in Latin America. How can we connect this short-term 5 years project with the long-term strategies to produce social equity? So that's a big challenge. How do we connect the long terms and the short terms? And finally, probably the most important thing is that we were talking a lot about governance and the big problem that most of the projects were developed for only some privileged people that have had access to the opportunity that the city have, or the social environment, the urban built environment has. So we were talking about the importance of participation and to broaden the stakeholders that are included in our projects, and our policies, and how can we include the voice of the people in any process that we are developing as designers or policymakers. So this is everything that we have for now. Diane, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ignacio. I think you really highlighted what I think is the richness of this particular issue, and in that it presents the voices and the views of urban designers, of policy makers, of planners, of social scientists. There's visual representations. It's a very rich issue that comes at mobility and transport from a variety of vantage points. I want to encourage the audience to put some questions in the chat, but in the meantime, I thought I'd throw one out for some of the other panelists, including those who haven't had a chance to say something yet. I wanted to be purposely provocative about a question having to do with land use and urbanization and the kind of economic development that comes with real estate speculation in cities. Because as we know, one of the problems of mobility, but also one of the problems of sustainability is urbanization and the growth of cities. What is interesting to me, and of course there are driving forces that push the continual sprawl of cities all over the world, but especially in Latin America. What strikes me as interesting is that several of the pieces in this issue talk about cable cars as innovations that are being used in many different cities. Julio mentioned it. They started in Medellin. There's a topography in that city that kind of explains the use of cable cars, but now cable cars are everywhere. There's a cable car line in Mexico City. There's a cable car line in Santiago, I believe. There are many articles that talk about it. I'd like to ask our panelists to say a little something about whether they think that the innovation, that transport innovation, is just another way to have your cake and eat it too, which is think about mobility, but not stop the real estate development and the land speculation that's driving growth that will continue to create unsustainable urban environments. In other words, I'm asking you, and maybe Arturo, Ardila, who I also worked with at MIT many years ago, can say something about the bank's view on that. But to what extent are these innovations that we're seeing that are being discussed really just reproducing the problem rather than solving the problem? Does anybody want to jump in on that, or Julio?
I can, Diane. Thank you for mentioning. I had raised my hand. Okay. 1 billion people worldwide live in slums. World Bank research shows one of the key causes is the inefficiency of land use regulations. We talk a lot about transit-oriented development. We talk a lot about master planning. We talk about integrating land use and urban planning. We don't talk about the specific regulations, minimum parking requirements, setbacks, backyards, maximum floor area ratio, and ad infinitum regulations that distort market behavior and price out the poor. Gentrification can actually be understood in part through the lens of inefficient regulations. I'm leading a new activity, analytical, at the World Bank, where we're trying to understand not only transit-oriented development, but also the transport and land use through the lens of making land use regulations more efficient, not eliminating them all, and linking with affordability, because many times the TOD canon calls for the high rise, which is affordable for the wealthy, but not for the one who lives in the slum. Back to you, Diane.
No, great. Thank you so much, Arturo. Actually, your comment, and I don't see everybody's hands up, but I see now I'm going to call on a few other people, but I wanted to say your comment actually aligns with one of the comments that just came through in the Q&A, where somebody mentioned the importance of thinking about all the sustainable development goals. So if we talk about informality, we talk about equity, we talk about gender, etc. What you're giving is a kind of overall package of how all the elements have to be looked at the same time when you're talking about land use regulation setbacks. And I think that's really important. And I do believe that transport specialists are in a privileged position to think about connectivity across those sectors and scales, because that's actually the nature of mobility. It's about connectivity. But we have some other questions I wanted to call on. First, Jorge, and then Ignacio, and then Jose de León. So Jorge, please.
Thank you, Diane. I'm going to speak in Spanish. No, gracias a todos y a todas.
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to talk about the cable car. In Santiago, we don't have a cable car, just one, a touristic cable car. However, there is a project to build one for transportation and deregulation, urban deregulation and planning. Urban planning is dictated by free trade, and that is presented itself, Santiago, as a modern city, is still concentrated in the sectors where they have greatest investment, and the cable car, it wants to connect two zones that are with companies, large buildings with entrepreneurial city and our entrepreneurial sector, the main sources of employment. And this is an area that I worked on in the article that I published. If there's no urban planning that is aligned with the right of mobility that is currently being discussed in the constitutional process in Chile, large projects, large investments will continue concentrating there where there is the economic power, and it will continue reproducing segregation, spatial segregation, and territorial segregation of a characteristic of the Latin American cities. Ignacio.
Sorry, I just have to mention regarding your question, Diane, about the cable car and the fact that they are basically connecting one point A and B. So in my article, I was analyzing the case of San Agustin, one of the most famous cable car that was consequence of the case of Línea K in Medellin. And one something that happened in this project is that the government disencouraged the use of other modes of mobility, including walkability, because they would reduce the amount of people that will take the cable car. So there was a project was designed only from the perspective of the transportation, and when you walk around, there are other layers that create social urban connectivity. For example, sidewalks or other ways or staircases that are not completely understood. And I'm just talking about mobility. There were not other infrastructure that the city usually needs to create social equity. So basically, I completely agree with you. It's to understand that transportation as infrastructure is just a tool that needs to be overlapped with other strategies, not only design strategy, but also other politics and process of governance and participation in order to create a more just city. So transportation itself is not enough. That's the point.
Great, thank you. Jose?
Sí, gracias, Diane. Yo quería simplemente traer
Thank
el
you,
punto.
Diane. I wanted to bring in the point of view of Cuba. The two problems, structural or historical in Cuba, is housing, lack of housing, and the difficulty to build new housing. On the other side is transport and urban transport. In Cuba, it's the other extreme compared to the rest of Latin America. It's a country that has no private cars, strongly organized in labor issues, everything linked to the governmental institutions, governmental enterprises. So transportation to work and to school is organized up to the 90s. And then with changes, starting the 90s, due to the economic crisis, Cuba became the only country, sustainable country in the world, try to maintain that. And there are many differences and some common issues in Latin America and also in the global South, in developed countries, that these are problems that are appearing recently in Cuba, especially with the introduction of the market as a regulating element. And in that sense, I go back to what Julio was saying, experimenting and seeing that this is sort of a half the cake and eat it. And Cuba is interesting to see it and compare it to other places in the world, because all the measures to tackle the problems that have appeared in the 90s and even more with liberalization are having small responses, experimental and pilot, and we need to see if they reproduce problems that other countries that in Latin America they want to tackle, or maybe they find original dimensions that might be of help for analysis.
So happy you brought up the case of Cuba. That raises another larger framing question. I'm going to throw it out there, but I want to call on CHEO and Bernardo to speak as well. But it just another question we could talk about is the balance of the public and the private sector. So thinking, you've just kind of put that on the table with respect to the transitions and new ways of thinking about kind of sustainability or transport in Cuba. This also is kind of one of the dilemmas that we need to think about with respect to moving forward on sustainability. I think I don't need to tell anybody who's listening to this panel that what is unique or what is different about Latin America than, let's say, the United States is that mass transit is often provided by the private sector in Latin America, unlike in the United States. So it's like individual cars, and then there's not so much and mass transit is often offered by the public sector. But in Latin America, the private sector is providing mass transit as well. So it complicates the balance of public and private and thinking about sustainability. But CHEO, we'd like to hear from you. CHEO first, and then Bernardo.
Sí, gracias. Yo lo que quería era como señalar, en realidad,
I wanted to point out that there is a strong emphasis on how to connect the zones of low-income zone and the central areas where there is a strong economic activity, and the problem of transportation and equity has to do with that. How am I going to mobilize poor people where economic activity flourishes, and how to recognize when formal or informal areas, and also in the lack of knowledge of that area, and trying to generate, understand autonomy and try to offer the city from those spaces. So this is not a unidirectional trip, it's a bi-directional trip of recognition to all the zones and that make up the city.
Respond, Bernardo, I do want to share 2 questions that came through in the chat. You can feel free to respond to them or not, but just so I can share them for the next people that might answer. One has to do with a question about ciclorutas or bike lanes and how they're being funded. So maybe that's a question that you could answer quite well, but how they're being funded. By Richard Phillips asked that question. And then we have a question from Donna Kircher about the underscoring the fact that the first group mentioned projects focus on gender equity. And the question she poses is whether there have been any contact or communication with the UN Safe Cities project, which has a global focus that also stresses sustainability. So those are 2 general questions, but Bernardo, let's hear from you.
Gracias, Diane. Un placer estar aquí con todos ustedes.
Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure being here with you. The question on how the bike roads are being funded in Mexico, well, the government is doing so at a municipal or state level. And the good thing about this infrastructure is not so expensive. And complexity is how they distribute space. And the infrastructure protection, good signaling or signs, and a point. And going back to your question, and we should not leave aside urban development and also complexities that we have. I just wanted to point out and see in that vision is that the cable cars are good, they're good, and they have been an innovation. And we have had this fascination with certain technology. And yes, giving access, as CHEO was saying, giving access, which is fundamental, increase access in different ways. And I think these systems, what they do is that they're turning around many of the problems, how to make an integrated system of transportation and negotiation with those that are transporting. Once you reach a station, how you integrate a station with the with other transportation systems. So I don't think what we need to do is to look for a magical solution. However, we need to be careful with this, and as with BRT and the subway or trains. What we need to do is to have integrated system, multimodal systems, integrated systems. Cities have a limited resources, and we need to look for the best investment possible. Whether bicycle and public transportation is still the best.
Underscore to our audience that all the panelists today have contributed pieces to the special issues, so you want to take a look at them, each one of them. Julie, you want to have, I bet you're going to be able to respond to one of the questions in the chat, and then we'll call on Roberto after you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Diane. So I want to just highlight 2 different things. The first being that we've talked a lot about land use regulation and particularly peripheral or auto-constructed settlements as not having the best access to what we're labeling as, urban centralities in terms of where there's large or where urban agglomerations sort of form and there are more opportunities for employment. So one thing that we know with informal transit systems is that they actually do arrive at those urban centralities, right? So if we actually, in some of my other work, trace where they go and actually map it out, they go from low income areas to high income areas. So in a lack of or an absence, we're getting a economic development tool that is low-income individuals, providing entrepreneurial activity for themselves and also arriving at other places in the city, which is then providing an accessibility tool for individuals that live in low-income areas. So, I mean, just sort of highlighting, you know, informal transit systems actually do work in the city. They are a very functional part, talking about the chivas, furgonetas, taxirutas, etc. So I just want to give a shout out to that, that source of mobility within the city. That is integral to economic development and sustainability. And now related to the other question in terms of the UN Safe Cities project, I know in relationship to Quito, a lot of the work that has even come out in terms of thinking about gender as it relates to transport. There is a public safety program called Bájale el Acoso, which stemmed exactly from a study that was done on perceptions of safety and risk on the trolleybus, which is a BRT line here in Quito. I do think that there are conversations that do happen. When I was talking more specifically about some of the projects that I have been involved in terms of thinking about small scale, I was thinking across two different axes. The first being that if we provide women cycles in the city, we can probably deal with a lot of short trips that are often complicated trips that women have to make. And second, providing women bicycles will also give them hopefully an opportunity to get to work. There are different collectives throughout Latin America, particularly feminist urban cycling collectives that do this work. There's Macleta in Santiago, the work of Carishina and Bici here in Quito, the work of one of my fellow mobilities scholars, Paula Castañeda, works across these mechanisms as well. So there's a lot of different initiatives that are taking place through alternative urban collectives. And so that's why I was also sort of underscoring that when we think about participation and for whom are we being in, for who is the city, when we're thinking about like rights, what we actually, when we pay attention to these other collectives and autonomous organizations, we actually find out a lot about how people directly participate in the city and thus create new modes of economic development and sustainability. So.
Thank you, Julie. That was a great answer and really touched a lot of the issues that kind of loop through all the different groups as well as the chat. We're getting near the end of our time, but we do have one more hand up from Roberto. And I would like Roberto to be able to respond to some of the kind of last threads of the conversation. And then we will probably try to wrap it up with just a final thank you to everybody. But Roberto, please take the mic.
Gracias, Diane. Sí, yo quería...
Thank you, Diane. Yes, as Bernardo was saying about cable cars, I wanted to insist on transportation solutions. They don't just have to be mobility solutions to approach people. It has to satisfy their basic needs. So in this regard, the technological solutions from streets, with or without vehicles, motorized vehicles, inclusive streets, up until mass transport systems, depending on the scale and the intensity. But surrounding the cable car issue, there was a cable car that recently won the prize for the work of the year in a specialized journal for works in general, not just public works. And this line of the cable car said that among the benefits that it offers is that it contributed to bridging social gaps, which made it possible to have connectivity in the population. It improved, and they had more access They had trips, for example, that were 2 hours that went down to 40 minutes in some places. And furthermore, in this project, there was a market included, about 1,500 new business included along this new line in this place. So transportation in public spaces must do more than just interventions in infrastructure in public transport systems. It should be seen as an opportunity to improve living conditions of the coastal population and also the people who live at the beginning and the end of the line and also in between.
Great, thank you so much, Roberto. I think we're going to have to kind of close things up. I wanted to make a few final comments, maybe just building exactly on these last 2 points. Both Julie mentioned about employment and work as well as Roberto. I think one thing, we had asked our panelists to think about sustainability as a larger kind of hovering concern. And I do want to say that it's very important that many of the panelists have spoken about the ways in which transport and transit is becomes a form of employment and work for people. So there is income generated through transit and through offering of transit services. There are also other ways like development around transit nodes. But let's also remember, as Roberto just underscored, that in many large cities of Latin America, there are many hours of work lost in transit. So the question becomes about the balance. So offering transport services or mobility services provides some kind of economic livelihood for people. But on the other hand, there are other people that lose hours of the day in transit. So it seems to me we're like back to an equilibrium, not a gain. And that raises a question to me about why then we shouldn't be thinking about sustainability also, as well as economic employment. In other words, we may then keep economic employment you keep up economic employment, but there's a loss. So if we're not moving the envelope on that, why not come in on mobility through the lens of sustainability and think about the larger footprint and the larger territoriality? Now, as several of you have mentioned, changing land use and what you need to do to really get at the root causes of kind of urbanization that leads to carbon emissions and climate footprint problems is a huge political struggle. But maybe in another issue, June, we'll talk a little bit more about the politics of urban policy in general, housing, so many other things that Arturo mentioned that are part and parcel of creating a networked and a sustainable city that's also equitable. So I think transportation scholars have already been moving beyond the physicality of transit infrastructure. That's why the discourse has changed from transportation to mobility, but there's still more to do to bring in the larger politics of the built environmental context in which these innovations are basically unfolding, and how can we coordinate them in ways that continue to help us achieve sustainability goals. So I think was such a rich conversation with all of you. I'm going to turn it over to June to have some final remarks, but we are so appreciative, and I'm a contributor also to ReVista. I'm so honored to be in this special issue with all of you. I think it's a great issue. I hope that we will follow through on these conversations over time. And thank you all for participating. And thank you, our audience, for listening in and sharing your questions. So June, do you want to have some final remarks?
Yes, first of all, to thank you for being such a great moderator. Y gracias a todos los autores. Thanks to all the authors for this great collective effort. And thank you to our audience for being here at this very, very busy time of the season. This has just been a wonderful, wonderful experience. Gracias a todos.